Hi, good evening, everyone. We have a small technical delay, so we'll be about 5 to 10 minutes. If you need to use the washroom or want to pick something up from the bar, now is your chance. But again, it'll be about 5 to 10 minutes. Thanks.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us tonight for our event, Transforming the Past for the Future, Reclaiming Indigenous Cultural Heritage at the Thames Center for Fine Arts and all of y'all online. So, Hishe, Maggie Spivey Faulkner, Choho Jepkados. Hi, my name is Maggie Spivey Faulkner. I am the Assistant Chief of the Upper Georgia Tribal Town of the PD Indian Nation of Beaver Creek in South Carolina. And I'm also an Indigenous anthropological archaeologist. I sit on the Institute of Prairie and Indigenous Archaeology's Research Council, and I'm an assistant professor here in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Alberta. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the University of Alberta resides on Treaty 6 territory and the traditional homeland of the Métis. This territory is a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our community. To acknowledge the territory is to recognize the longer history of these lands. The acknowledgement signifies our commitment to working in good relations with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples as we engage in our institutional work, uplifting the whole people for the University of Tomorrow. U of A Days is a time when we welcome our community, alumni, and elders to the university to explore and celebrate the contributions of our research, teachings, our students, faculty and staff, our knowledge keepers, and our amazing alumni. Tonight, we will hear from 3 of our scholars, IPIA scholars, the Institute of Prairie and Indigenous Archaeology, who are exploring different but equally important aspects of Indigenous-led archaeology. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, and we will be taking questions from our in-person and the online audience, as well as questions that we've received in advance. It's wonderful to see such a diverse group of our alumni community, friends, family, donors, faculty and staff, professor emeriti, and students here tonight. We're also joined by several special guests to whom I'd like to extend a special welcome. University of Alberta President Flanagan joins us here tonight, as does Alumni Association President Tyler Hansen, Vice President of External Relations, Elin McDonald, Chancellor Garrity, and Dean Robert Wood. Members from the BHP Board, the Canadian Commission for UNESCO, Worldwide Universities Network, I've seen some of y'all come in, and our elders, Mary Cardinal Collins, Doreen Daychief, Molly Chisake, and Elmer Ghostkeeper, who are part of our initiative supporting Indigenous language revitalization. I'm thrilled to welcome you and all of our guests to our presentation of our scholars' important research done at the IPIA. So, I would now like to introduce our president, Bill Flanagan, the 14th president and vice chancellor of the University of Alberta. Born and raised in Alberta, Professor Flanagan holds a BA, English and Philosophy, from Carleton University, a Juris Doctorate from the University of Toronto, a DEA in International Economic Law from the Université Paris-Sorbonne, is that close? And a Master in Law from Columbia University. He joined the Faculty of Law at Queen's University in 1991, serving as their Dean of Law from 2005 to 2019, where he was known for his transformative and entrepreneurial leadership. He has made it a priority to really focus on Indigenous-led initiatives, research, and knowledge exploration at the University of Alberta. It's my privilege to invite President Flanagan to the stage to say a few words this evening. Welcome, President Flanagan.
Well, thank you, Maggie, and welcome, everyone. I'm really delighted to welcome you to this signature event for U of A Days. And you can see I've got my green and gold, and Maggie had that very snazzy green jacket. So we are here to celebrate the University of Alberta, and in particular, to celebrate our connection to the community that is so important to the University of Alberta. And so it's wonderful to see so many people here today, alumni and friends from the community. And I also want to give a warm welcome to everyone who is joining us remotely. I understand there's over 500 people online, so that's fantastic. And tonight we are honored to share with you research that is seeking answers into solutions to one of the country's most important commitments, advancing truth and reconciliation with all the Indigenous peoples of these lands. And for thousands of years, the territory where we live and work today was a place of diverse Indigenous nations, thinkers, scientists, philosophers, caretakers of the environment. They all gathered here to share and exchange knowledge. And the work being done today at the University of Alberta is a continuation of that long history. And truth and reconciliation is a journey that we walk together. And the U of A's response to the truth and reconciliation calls to action and our commitment to reconciliation means that we are continually learning how to be in better relations and better partnerships with the Indigenous peoples of these lands. And at the U of A, we're proud that this work is Indigenous-led and supported by our dedicated staff, faculty, and community partners. And under the leadership of Florence Glanfield. Florence, are you here tonight? I didn't see. Oh, that's right. I was on an earlier call today and she's got a terrible cold. So, but I did want to mention Florence. And it was under Florence's leadership that Florence is our Vice Provost of Indigenous Programming and Research, that this year we launched the university's first Indigenous strategic plan, an important step in our commitment to reconciliation. So thank you, Florence, and thank you to all your colleagues and community members for your leadership in bringing this plan to life. And the U of A has a deep commitment to Indigenous research and teaching. We're enormously proud of our Faculty of Native Studies and its groundbreaking teaching and research, advancing the study of Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing. And this afternoon, I was honored to attend a meeting of our Institute for Supporting Indigenous Language Revitalization, along with representatives of the BHP Foundation, many of whom are here this evening. You just might wave here. This is an enormously generous foundation that is supporting the work of the Indigenous language revitalization here at the university. So we had an opportunity to learn a little bit more about this initiative and an opportunity to meet and thank our donors. And we have built on programs that are removing barriers for Indigenous students, for example, with dedicated programs in medicine and education, and so much more. And tonight's program features the remarkable and deeply moving work being done by the Institute of Prairie and Indigenous Archaeology, the first of its kind in Canada. This is an Indigenous-led institute with a deep commitment to supporting Indigenous engaged archaeological practices. And the scholars you will hear from tonight are internationally recognized in their field. They are committed to placing Indigenous ways of knowing at the core of their work. They are reinventing and expanding the field of archaeology to ensure that archaeology is done for and with Indigenous people. So Dr. Kisha Supernant is here. Kisha, wave your hand. And we will hear from Kisha shortly. She is the leading figure in the search for burial sites at former residential schools. And we're enormously proud to call you a colleague here at the university. And PhD candidate, Stephanie Hamhoff. Stephanie, oh, there you are. And Stephanie will share her work that is focused on the ways archaeology and pseudo-archaeology is used by conspiracy and cult movements in North America. Welcome, Stephanie. And we'll also hear how PhD candidate Céline Mallet-Gauthier, Céline, welcome, work is using archaeology to contribute to the understanding of Métis identity through food and food-related practices. And the research advancements of groups like the Institute of Prairie and Indigenous Archaeology are helping us access and understand Indigenous truths and knowledge that is fundamental as we walk together along the path of truth and reconciliation. And we have much work ahead of us, and we all have a role to play. So thank you, all of you, for joining us and being partners on that path. So tonight's event is part of our brand new U of A Days, and building on our former alumni weekend celebrations, we wanted to extend a big welcome to all of our friends, neighbors, and partners throughout the wider community. And one of the U of A's great strengths is the deep connection we have throughout the Edmonton region, across Alberta and beyond. You are our partners in research. You are our partners in creating, enriched learning and working experiences for our students. Together, we are leading and enabling positive change here in Edmonton and around the world. So thank you for your steadfast support, and I look forward to continuing to work with you to achieve our shared vision for a better world. And now I am honored to introduce Elder Elmer Ghostkeeper, who will open our event with a prayer. A respected elder, language carrier, author, and scholar, Elder Ghostkeeper is from the Paddle Prairie Métis settlement in northern Alberta, and he has deep connections to the land. He received an Order of the Métis Nation Award for his dedication to the recognition of Métis peoples and their rights. He is a very proud U of A alumnus, and I have to say I was working earlier today with Elder Ghostkeeper and in support of the Institute that I mentioned earlier, and I was saying to him that I think we're working him too hard. He said, I see him all the time at events, always at U of A, and he said to me, but I'm a graduate. He said, I can't say no to U of A. So thank you, Elder Ghostkeeper, for all of your, we've met many times, and I look forward to continuing to work with you in support of the university. So as I mentioned, Elder Ghostkeeper, he is an alumnus. He has a Master of Arts degree in anthropology. His master's thesis led to his book, Spirit Giving, the Concept of Spiritual Exchange. And he is a fellow of the Arctic Institute, and he was the first recipient of McGill University's New Sun Fellowship. So welcome, Elder Ghostkeeper. And if you could come up, yes. Welcome. And Elder Ghostkeeper, I offer you this protocol to ask that you create an ethical space this evening so that we can learn in a good way. And please join me in welcoming Elder Ghostkeeper. And we also have some additional gifts to thank you for being here tonight and sharing your knowledge with us. All kinds of goodies.
Oh,
And I can, if you like, I can take these down and put them on your seat.
Spirit gifting.
Spirit gifting.
For a second, no, my hand.
Here, I'll just leave it at your seat. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Merci, Yugon Most. That's a key. Wow. Kahkeuna naskumtena. Wow. Omuta kapitohti iki pihtamik. Viipiks kuata. Wow. Atuski when ito tak. Kisha Supernant. Métis wistamina. Machazim skamot. Awasak. Nagataski tau. Mission schools or residential schools. Thank you so much. It's a great honor to be asked to say an opening prayer and to create an ethical space. Dr. Willie Ermine came up with this concept fairly recently, whereby if we create the ethical space, then worldviews are equally valid, whether they're Western or Indigenous. they're equally valid if we create the ethical space. So I want to say the prayer in my first language, which is Bushland Cree, Nihiawiyan, Sagao Nihiawiyan. My second language is Michif, and my third language is English. I'm a fluent Cree speaker and Michif speaker, so I'm going to say it in my first language. And Nihiawiyan, 80% of the words are verbs and 20% are nouns. It's the same thing with Michif, but the nouns are French. So when I speak in my language, my worldview changes to movement. I see everything moving. It's a living, Mother Earth's a living being, and it's in constant motion. And when I switched to English, everything seems separated from one another. And, you know, when there's very few verbs in a sentence, I think there's one verb and one noun in English. And that's not enough action to give you the feeling of connection with the land. Our belief is we live with the land. We don't live off the land, because the land is a living being and it needs stewardship. Muma ni nanos awasak o ti miskwa nestawgito. We don't steward the land for ourselves, but the children that are coming, that are not born yet, for 7 generations. So machigi gwa and kanaimahan. Mamwino tawi mau nigwa kegani no. Aswitam nana samana umagisagaw kamigosiak. Mina toapah tamak pisum tasamana mak pisum yiguana kitna achak. Mina timiu menikuyak, timiu ihiyak, timiu mitsiak. Timiu muhtiyak, timiu masoyak, timiu matsiak. Mina uma kawi piksquit, timiasek, miguasoma igua otinigan, minasce. Igone petama mama tawi mau, igua kigani no, hai igua mercy.
Thank you so much for that, Elder Ghost Keeper, really. It's with great pleasure that I now introduce and welcome the Dean of the Faculty of Arts here at the University of Alberta, Dr. Robert Wood. Dr. Wood's a proud University of Alberta alumnus in sociology and is a champion for our institution as well as for the fine arts, humanities, and the social sciences. Welcome, Dr. Wood.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction. Hello, everybody, and thanks for being here tonight at the Tims Center, either in person or online. My name is Robert Wood. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Arts, and as we heard, also a very proud alumnus of my faculty. And I have the honor tonight of introducing Dr. Kisha Supernant, who is a director of the Institute for Prairie and Indigenous Archaeology, a full professor in the Department of Anthropology at the U of A, and also a member of the Royal Society of Canada. An award-winning teacher, researcher, and writer, Dr. Supernant's research interests include the relationship between cultural identities, landscapes, and the use of space, Métis archaeology, and heart-centered archaeological practice. Her research with Indigenous communities in Western Canada explores how archaeologists and communities can build collaborative research relationships. Among her numerous research projects, Dr. Supernant leads the Exploring Métis Identity through Archaeology project, which takes a relational approach to exploring the material past of Métis communities, including her own family in Western Canada. She's also a co-investigator on Cartographies of the Deep, a SSHRC Insight Grant project that explores the complexities of history and different ways of knowing with Tsimshian communities in British Columbia. Additionally, in recent years, Dr. Supernant has been increasingly engaged in helping First Nations communities in Western Canada use remote sensing technologies to locate and protect unmarked burials. And Dr. Supernant was recently appointed to the National Advisory Committee on Missing Children and Unmarked Graves. Dr. Supernant and her colleagues in the IPIA are building a transformative and highly impactful community of practice that has three main strands: practice, policy, and pedagogy, the foundation of which is integrating Indigenous ways of knowing and being with archaeology. We in the Faculty of Arts and at the U of A are deeply grateful to include Dr. Supernant and the IPIA in our faculty community. We're also deeply grateful for the support and the appreciation that our community has shown towards the IPIA. In recent months, for example, we've received over $25,000 in donations from numerous alumni and community members in support of the IPIA. We've also received a significant pledge from Mr. Larry Andrews of Landrex Inc., who is an alumnus of the Faculty of Arts and a very strong supporter of the IPIA. To our entire alumni community, I offer my most sincere gratitude. I welcome you again. And now with that, it's my great privilege to welcome to the stage Dr. Kisha Supernant.
Good evening, Tanse. Kisha Supernant egwa awasa kapiguita hadnitsi katsan, miskuchiwa sky ganu chinia, otipimisiwaknia. So great to see all of you. I won't include any more of my introduction because there was already a very lengthy one. But I will say, this place we call Edmonton now, or Miskuchiwa Skygon, is a place where my family has very deep and long connections. And it's always great to be here to gather and to gather in person. And it's really great to see faces here and also to welcome the folks who are online. So I'm going to begin by telling you just very, very briefly about the IPIA in terms of what it is that we do, what our kind of focus is. Oh, there we go. Here we go. Yes, a little bit about our vision. So Dean Wood, with those kind words, certainly gave you a bit of a sense of that. And also I really want to honor and appreciate Elder Ghostkeeper for creating an ethical space where we can have what can sometimes be uncomfortable conversations when we're talking about transformation. And so one of the things that we really focus on at the IPIA is about community-led research. So this is where we work closely with Indigenous communities, many times ones that we may be members of. So I work with the Métis Nation, for example, to create research projects that matter to those communities, that address current issues that might be of interest, that use archaeological techniques to explore landscapes and reclaim our stories. And we really do this by building a community of practice here that can do respectful, ethical work, use cutting edge technology, so really trying to push the boundaries and really rethink ultimately what archaeology is about. But there are many aspects to the process of engaging archaeology in different kinds of ways. And so one of the things, I think I'm ahead of myself here. There we go. So the core areas that we have are practice, pedagogy, and policy. And at the core of that is how we can be good relations. And I'll talk quite a bit more in my talk about what it means to me in terms of being good relations. But I think these three areas are really, really important. So just very briefly, I want to talk about what these each mean. So pedagogy is about how we train the next generation of archaeologists, of thinkers and scholars, of folks who will enter into all realms of archaeology. I certainly was trained in a way that told me archaeology was something very specific. And it was very much about the sort of empirical study, scientific study of past objects and analyzing those objects, running statistical analyses, radiocarbon dating. And that was the way that archaeology told stories about the past. And when we train the next generation to have a more expansive view, a more holistic view, a more Indigenous view of what archaeology can and should be, then we can transform the future of the discipline itself. Another piece to this puzzle, of course, let's see if I can, there we go, is the policy side. So archaeology is highly regulated, and archaeological materials are managed in very particular ways through policy and legislation. So I can train all the archaeologists that I want to do things differently, but if the policy and the legislation don't allow them to practice in the ways that they need, they don't support Indigenous communities to uphold their rights to their own cultural heritage, then we're not doing all of the work that we need. So one of my interests really is in how do we transform the ways in which archaeology is regulated and legislated to uphold, to recognize the rights of Indigenous peoples to their own cultural heritage and transform the discipline as a whole, even including outside of the academy. Trying to figure this out. We're having all sorts of, there we go. So the one other thing I want to talk about is it's really important when we're engaging in this work that it's not something we do on our own. I am not IPIA. IPIA is a community of scholars. It's a community of practice. And we also get a lot of support from others as part of the broader circles. So we have an administrative board, which helps us understand the kind of structure and finances and all of those details and give us advice on that. We have a research committee, of which Maggie is a part, which helps us understand programming and get a sense from the community of our scholars about what they might want to see and do. And then we have an advisory circle, which includes members of Indigenous communities. It includes members of other organizations related to archaeology. So this is not just about my scholarship or the scholarship of my students. This is about a real collective and wanting to make sure that we're moving in ways that makes sense. I'll get this figured out eventually. Yes. So what we're going to do now is we're going to have a couple of research presentations from a couple of our amazing IPIA scholars, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the other things we're involved in. So it is my very great pleasure to first introduce PhD student Stephanie Helmhofer, whose work is really about how archaeological knowledge, often of Indigenous lands and histories, gets taken up in conspiritual and cult movements. And yeah, she'll get to tell you about all kinds of really cool things. So please join me in welcoming Stephanie Helmhofer.
Hello, everybody. My name is Steph. I'm an archaeology PhD student in the Department of Anthropology and in the IPIA, as Kisha just said. And tonight I'm going to give you really just a very brief and general overview of my research. I don't really have time to go into the specific focus. So I'm just going to share information about the broader umbrella topic of pseudoarchaeology, which I think is something people recognize by content, but maybe not by name. So I'm going to introduce that to you. If we get to my slides. Here we go. There we go. Okay, so what do I research? Very broadly speaking, my research looks at the role that pseudoarchaeology plays in North American conspirituality. Most of my research focus is on far right ideas. Neither the right nor conspirituality are the only places that you find pseudoarch. Conspirituality refers to the blending of New Age spirituality and conspiracy theories. And in a moment, I'll get into what pseudoarchaeology is. Conspirituality, it's a term that came about in 2011. It's pretty recent, but it's been around for a lot longer than that. Although that's history is pretty understudied. Hasn't been studied at all from an archaeological perspective, at least not that I know of, which is what I'm trying to do. Most of my research is focused on Brother 12 and the far-right conspiritual cult he led in British Columbia in the late 1920s and 1930s. You see him on the left. It was called the Aquarian Foundation. And the 1930s were also a transitional period in the development of the contemporary North American far right. He's part of that history. My research also examines pseudoarchaeology's use in contemporary conspirituality, like, for example, QAnon's conspiritual subcommunities. Sure, we all recognize that dude. I've watched too many of his videos, I will tell you that. My research includes fieldwork in 2 locations, one at Brother 12 settlements in a more traditional sense, and my other field site is the internet, where I digitally excavate through a lot of very questionable videos and browse very terrible websites. 10 out of 10, do not recommend. On the screen is the definition of pseudoarchaeology that I use in my work, which I drew together from many different disciplines, including archaeology, political science, sociology, anthropology. The too long didn't read version is that pseudoarchaeology refers to archaeological conspiracy theories. And these are conspiracy theories that are heavily biased against racialized peoples and cast doubt upon their histories by arguing that none of that history was possible without the involvement of someone or something else. As such, I include a lot of work from political scientists, anthropologists, sociologists who study conspiracy theories, which gives me better insight into pseudoarch's place in the broader picture of conspiracism outside of just archaeology. And far-right conspiracy theory and extremism researchers have also been doing a lot of work finding better ways to address these issues and respond to these issues. So I'm also looking there for ideas on how we can use that in archaeology to respond and engage with all these very terrible people. I have other words for them, but I won't use them tonight. There are many, many different pseudo-archaeological theories, which can largely be placed into 3 main categories, though of course there's no firm borders, there's often overlap between them. There are ancient astronaut or aliens theories, which propose extraterrestrials interfered in human evolution, sometimes by creating structures, sometimes by giving us technology, or sometimes it's genetic manipulation. There are hyperdiffusionist theories that argue a single, almost supernatural culture spread around the world, again, sharing technology or building structures or manipulating us. Of these, Atlantis is the most well-known. There are other similar theories like Lemuria and Mu and Tartaria. And then there are religious or nationalist theories. Sometimes these are just adoptions of pseudo-archaeological theories for religious or nationalist purposes. Other times there's theories created specifically for those purposes. Sometimes extraterrestrials are involved. There's more UFO and extraterrestrial related religions out there than one would think. Okay, good. So pseudoarchaeology is also really popular in many forms of popular media, like television shows, books, comics, YouTube videos, TikTok, etc. I'm sure most of us here have heard of the television show Ancient Aliens, for example, which is just wrapping up its 18th season on the History Channel. Discovery Channel has aired documentaries about Atlantis, a gazillion of them. Browsing TikTok, you'll find loads of videos about Atlantis and Lemuria. YouTube, also loads of videos. And in almost every chapter's bookstore I go to, I look for it specifically. There's a section called Controversial Knowledge, where you can find all sorts of pseudo-arch books about aliens, Atlantis, mound builders, giants, so on and so forth. Look for it next time you're there. But what these books and these shows and movies are all conveniently leaving out is that pseudoarchaeology is a theft of history. This quote from Evaristo Benheiro's article on thefts of history, I think, is a great snapshot at how denial and reattribution of history is a theft of history. There are many examples of sites and artifacts being physically damaged or stolen to support pseudoarchaeological narratives. But I also want us to consider that recontextualizing archaeological and historical sites and artifacts with words, whether in a book or on a website or in a YouTube video, is also a theft of history. Almost every time I am talking about pseudoarch, someone will always say, nobody actually believes this. Or they'll try to, convince me nobody actually believes it. But the truth is that people do believe these theories. On the screen is a snapshot from part of the Chapman Survey of American Fears, which featured a paranormal belief section. In 2018, 41% of Americans believed in ancient aliens, which is actually a 14% increase from 2016. In 2018, 57% of Americans believed in Atlantis and similar things to Atlantis. And that's actually a 17% increase. So yes, people do believe these theories. Someone has to create the theories that people believe, but why? Why steal history? Why recontextualize it into a new narrative? This article from Suzanne Kite is generally a really great article, but this quote, I think, provides a concise snapshot for us. History is stolen to create a conspiracy of space that makes the land easier for settlers to take or claim. And now I want to give a few examples I think that might highlight this. This is where it gets kind of gross, I'm sorry. Yeah, we're starting off on a gross note. Pseudoarchaeology is not a new thing. The conspiratorial aspect is maybe the youngest part of it, but pseudoarch theories related to North America have been around for a really long time. Mound builder theories are one such example. Mound builder theories refer to the large earthworks that First Nations peoples constructed in the US and Canada. The argument is that the mounds were too complex for First Nations to have built, so it had to have been someone else. Who that someone else is depends on who you talk to. Some say it was the lost tribes of Israel. Some say it was Atlantis. Others have proposed that the mounds were burial mounds of giants and that the Smithsonian Institute is hiding their skeletons. It's always the Smithsonian. But the core of the theory is always the same. First Nations didn't do it. And in 1830, American President Andrew Jackson actually used the mound builder theory to defend the Indian Removal Act. He argued that the mounds were constructed by an earlier people that were killed by the contemporary nations, who then had no historical connection to the land. And this idea of an earlier people being killed off is also something that's popular in white supremacy, which I'll talk about briefly in a bit. Brother 12 was generally an Atlantis dude. His New Age beliefs came from allegedly ancient Atlantean artifacts, and he believed his work of transitioning humanity into New Age had actually started during the time of Atlantis. Brief background info, Brother 12 adhered to New Age ideas that humanity passed through a series of evolutionary spiritual states called the root races, and that he was living in the time of the fifth root race. When he and the Aquarian Foundation began building their first settlement in British Columbia, they quickly realized they were building on top of some of the Snuneymuxw Nation's archaeological sites. In the house, they were digging into shellmen in some areas, there were petroglyphs in other areas. For example, the house in the photos is the Aquarian Foundation Center House. I was actually there just last month. In the photo at the top, in the spot just below where the 1927 is written, there's a large boulder with petroglyphs on it. And about 70 meters away, there's even more petroglyphs. Brother 12 believed that the Aquarian Foundation might actually be looking at evidence of the lost land, which was originally located around the North Pole and had been shifted south during the sinking of Atlantis. It was the place where the first two root races lived, and Brother 12 recontextualized Snuneymuxw's history so that they became descendants of the root races who inhabited that lost land. Now, Brother 12 didn't deny that the Snuneymuxw Nation had history where he was building, he just reattributed it to someone else. Another contemporary example of something similar can be found in Iowa, where a group of fringe Mormon researchers have been conducting excavations and geophysical surveys to prove that they found the Mormon city of Zarahemla. Now, I say this is a fringe group because they adhere to something called the Heartland model, which argues that the geography of the Book of Mormon is actually located in the Heartland region of the United States. And this is a fringe idea even within Mormonism. This group, called the Heartland Research Group, brought a property in Iowa where they've been conducting terrible archaeological excavations. There's a lot of First Nations archaeological history in the area, and that's actually what this group is looking for. They believe that First Nations are the descendants of the Lamanites spoken about in the Book of Mormon. Every site, every belonging they uncover is recontextualized and reattributed to the Lamanites. I should also mention that the guy in charge of this group has been publishing a popular pseudo-archaeological magazine about North America for around 25 years. Excuse me. He's actually starting a new one as well, specifically about this work. Sorry. So Kite's comment about reshaping the land so that it was always possessed by Europeans is especially obvious in far-right uses of pseudo-archaeology. Because pseudo-archaeology casts doubt primarily on racialized people, it's found a really comfortable home in far-right ideologies like white nationalism and neo-Nazism. I wrote an article about this last year for the website Sapiens if you want a little bit more information than what I have time to discuss tonight, but I am going to briefly talk about the solution hypothesis. Big size. Now, earlier I mentioned the idea of an earlier people being killed off as being popular with white supremacists. They believe that's called the white genocide theory, and the Solutrean hypothesis had been used to support it. The Solutrean hypothesis is a discredited archaeological theory that, to sum it up in the most basic sense, proposed people from Western Europe were the first to settle in the Americas about 22,000 years ago. White supremacists have jumped on this and argued that the hypothesis is true, and it's proof that their white ancestors were in North America first and were violently killed by Indigenous peoples who moved into the Americas later. The theory is really popular in white supremacist spaces. For example, there was a popular white supremacist novel written about the Solutrean hypothesis that featured a white archaeologist who'd found proof of it and was trying to get that out and was being suppressed by political powers. It's also really popular on white supremacist chat forums and websites. In fact, if you do a Google search on the Solutrean hypothesis, I highly recommend using Safe Search because without it, you will be directed to a ton of white supremacist websites. I did this the other night and my search results were very, very gross. So in conclusion, and to generally sum up what I've been trying to point out, pseudoarchaeology steals history and it replaces it with these fantasized narratives that promote religious, nationalist, white supremacist, xenophobic, and colonialist ideas. Those are the messages being spread to its audience, who in turn spread those messages further. And we can all play a role in breaking that cycle by challenging pseudoarchaeology and challenging the structures it supports and recenter the voices of the peoples in telling of Indigenous peoples in telling their own histories and ensure that those are the histories that are being heard. Thank you.
Oh man, Steph, I was jealous of your research until you brought up Andrew Jackson. And that guy, he takes up too much of my brain space already. So you can keep it. Okay, sorry, comment to the crowd. So thank you for your presentation. So now I'd like to introduce another one of our scholars, Céline Mallet-Gauthier. Sorry about your middle name. I'm sure I butchered it. Céline's an IPIA scholar and anthropology PhD student under the direction of Dr. Kisha Supernant. She's Acadian and originally from New Brunswick and studied at Université Laval prior to coming to the U of A. Welcome, Céline.
Thank you, Maggie. Good evening, everyone. My name is Céline, and as Maggie just said, I'm a PhD candidate in anthropology here at the U of A. So I'm going to use the next few minutes to, there you go, to talk about my doctoral research project, but in fact, mostly about the framework that I am using to approach my research topic, and then I'll be using to understand archaeological data. My research fits within a larger project called IPIA, which was mentioned a bit earlier this evening. IPIA stands for Exploring Métis Identity Through Archaeology. In my case, I focus on the study of identity through food and food-related practices, and in this case, more specifically on late 19th century overwintering or hivernant Métis identity and its expression and construction through food. For those who might not be familiar, the Métis are post-contact Indigenous people from what we call today Western Canada and the Northern United States. During the second half of the 19th century, many Métis, whose livelihood revolved around bison hunting, would spend the winter in the prairies instead of returning to larger settlements. These are what we call overwintering or hivernant settlements. One might ask, why did I choose food to address identity through the study of food? Well, first, it's a topic that I'm personally very interested in. But aside from that, the topic of Métis identity has mostly been approached in a way that equated identity to artifacts, which blurred the possibility of seeing the subtleties of Métis identity making and its distinctiveness. Using food then is basically a new way of approaching Métis identity in archaeology. Additionally, in culturally mixed societies, such as late 19th century Western Canada, material culture is often more indicative of the dominant group's economic and trade networks than the user's identity. So in the present case, much of the material culture that we find on Métis archaeological sites is more easily associated, in fact, with colonial trade networks than with Métis identity. In situations like these, looking at food and food-related practices often offer a better opportunity to approach the topic of identity. Food is especially interesting to archaeologists because it holds meaning beyond nutritional value. Indeed, it is central to society as it holds important roles in many, many situations. Through quotidian practices, food defines communities with shared cultural practices, such as cooking and food consumption, as well as with symbolic meaning. Foodways often serve to mark group membership and belonging, as well as difference and exclusion. Societies also often use culturally important foods as metaphors of themselves. The family, especially, is an important location of identity formation, but also where a lot of food-related activities happen. The meals and food-related practices taking place in a familial context are therefore of particular interest, as the family then becomes a group, a site rather of group and individual identity formation through food. Ultimately, because of its connection to the social self and to the everyday practices, the study of food then allows archaeologists to study past people's worldviews and experiences rather of being in the world. Traces of the expression of these concepts is thus materialized in food, shared practices, and bodily actions. When I first started my research, I quickly realized that I couldn't really consider hivernant Métis food and identity without considering first the relationship to the environment. The environment held an important place in Métis identity through their seasonal movements, as well as through their cultural, spiritual, and economic activities. Indeed, most of the overwintering Métis spent a considerable part of the year moving and living on the land, all while hunting, trapping, fishing, gathering plants, and trading. And while they did often maintain ties with trading posts and larger settlements, they did obtain the majority, if not all, of their food directly from the environment. In order to try to represent this as accurately as possible, in my research, I use a more culturally appropriate and relevant framework to understand the environment in this context than what is usually encountered in traditional archaeological approaches. Here, I'm approaching the environment using relationality, which is a concept that shares many similarities with the Cree and Métis concepts of Wokutowin, which denotes interconnectedness, kinship, but also obligations. Ultimately, then, to understand food, what I need is to understand first the relation with the land and the environment. Now, how did food and the environment actually participate in the construction and the expression of late 19th century Métis overwintering identity? And also, what kind of identity was actually expressed? Good questions. In my research, I suggest that Métis women specifically were at the core of identity building and expression. They took on particular roles in overwintering Métis society, and through these had a direct impact on the expression and the construction of identity using food and the relation with the environment. Women were, and of course still are, very important in Métis families. Women served as connectors between different kin groups, leading to the creation of large groups such as bison hunting brigades, which were centered around female kin networks. They were also central to the bison skinning and butchering activities, to the preparation of bison meat, as well as to much of the gathering of fuel and plant foods, the hunting of small fowl, food preparation, and cooking. Because of their activities, women also gained a particular connection to the land. So it's through their central roles in their families that women contributed to the construction and the expression of identity using food and food-related practices. I hypothesize that the type of identity I will find in archaeological remains associated with food will probably, in fact, resemble some form of kinship. So this makes a lot of sense especially if we take into account the importance of kinship in the definition of a broader Métis identity, but also since women's ability to constitute and structure family identity through food practices has been recorded in many settings and not only in Métis environments. So the methods I'll be using to study identity come from the discipline of environmental archaeology. And in fact, we'll focus on the analysis of seeds and insect remains. I have some pictures here on this slide. These are actually from a different site I've worked on, so they're not from my current research. And so insects and seed remains found in sediments in contexts that are associated with food. So these methods are rarely, if ever, in fact, used in post-contact archaeological sites in Western Canada. But they have the potential to tell us a lot about the past. In my case, I'll be looking for plants and insects that are directly or indirectly indicative of what foods were eaten and how they were prepared, stored, and eventually disposed of. So these methods involve taking sediment samples at archaeological sites, sorting through them to find insect and seed remains, identifying these remains, and then understanding what they actually mean in the context the sample was taken from. So this will be done using various sources of information, pardon me, including information about Métis traditional foods. The site I'm focusing on for my research is called Chimney Coulee. I have some pictures here. It's a late 19th century wintering site located in the Cypress Hills in southwestern Saskatchewan. So I've finally been able to understand my first fieldwork season for this project over the summer. So these are fresh pictures. My team of volunteers and I, which notably included Steph, were able to identify 2 new Métis cabins on this site. We excavated small parts of these 2 cabins, and I was able to collect a number of sediment samples during the excavation, and I will be analyzing them over the winter. As this work is still ongoing, I'm hoping to return to Chimney Coulee next summer to really expand our understanding of the site and gather samples from different areas of these cabins. In conclusion, I hope that this brief overview of my project was at least a bit interesting, but also managed to show just how much space there is for new research topics in post-contact archaeology in Western Canada, but also more specifically in the archaeology of the Métis. People will sometimes joke around saying that soon archaeologists will have dug up everything there is to find. However, modern archaeology doesn't only rely on finding new objects. Research projects, such as mine to an extent and Steph's, now increasingly include new technologies, methods, or ways of doing research used alongside various conceptual approaches that in fact most ultimately provide more nuanced understandings of the past that also revisit old themes, but also create knowledge that is relevant to modern communities. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Selene. She kind of buried this a little bit, but I'd like to point out, she's talking about connecting bugs to identity. Okay. There is so much deep thought and careful examination and work going into this project. Like, recognize that. She's on the cutting edge. Okay. So thank you. So that wraps up our nascent scholar talks. Okay. And if you're interested, they're not the only people working at the IPIA. There is a whole passel of students doing fantastic stuff, including some in the field right now, Liam. So go to the IPIA's website to get more information on their work. So I'd now like to ask for the main event, Dr. Kisha Supernant, to join us on stage for the keynote presentation.
And I apologize in advance to the tech people because I use a different slide format, so now they have to change that all around. Decide not to make it easy for them. Okay, I think we're just going to get up my slides. So You've heard a little bit about some of the specific projects, and what I'm really going to talk about are the broader reach of what we're trying to do at IPIA. And specifically, I'm talking tonight about archaeology, Indigenous knowledge, and restorative justice. And it really comes down to a really fundamental question about archaeology. But it's really important. You've heard a fair bit about me already tonight, but I want to tell you a little bit more. I want to tell you about who I'm related to. So these are some of my family names. I mentioned already, I have deep connections here in Edmonton in Northern Alberta. I also have ties back to the Red River settlement in Winnipeg. And I have been on a long journey of finding out who I am. And my work as an archaeologist has really helped me to understand my living connections and relatives, as well as the vibrant histories and lives of my ancestors. So it's really important for me to, talk that I am related to so many different families. It also is my little attempt to find cousins, which I do all the time in Alberta. So if anyone recognizes the surname, come talk to me after. And this is me with a Red River cart at Fort Edmonton on a day where we were doing an archaeology event, and it's me and my mocks and my sash and my archaeology gear. So that's what I look like when I'm in the field, minus the mocks. But what we're really talking about when we're talking about transforming archaeology is we're asking really fundamental questions. What is archaeology and who is it for? So I mentioned before that I was very much trained in a way that, it's the material study of the past, the scientific study of the past for the good of everyone. So this idea that we were adding knowledge to the commons in some way, that it was sort of for the good of everyone, telling the stories of the past, and that it was for kind of public consumption. It was for enriching our understandings. But what this really glosses over is where archaeology comes from. So archaeology is fundamentally based on an idea of extraction. And if you think about excavation, what is it that we're actually doing? We are taking things out of the land, right? We are digging holes into the land and taking them out. So very much this idea of extraction of things, but then also extraction of knowledges. And Steph's work really points this out well. The pseudo-archaeology erases that history. And in many ways, archaeology seeks to rewrite Indigenous histories through a lens of archaeology. So when we talk about, people have been in this land for thousands of years, that's not something Indigenous people say. We say we've been here since time immemorial. These are not the same ways of understanding the past. Archaeology is a handmaiden of colonization. When non-Indigenous people came to these lands and started to settle, they started to try to capture and gather as much information about the Indigenous peoples of these lands because they thought we were disappearing. They thought we were just going to become like everybody else. And therefore, very much this, let's go in and dig their stuff up and tell those stories. Archaeology also has traditionally really centered empiricism and Western ways of knowing. So Elmer created us an ethical space here where those ways of knowing can be equal. In archaeology, they're not, and they're still not equal. There's still a place where scientific knowledge holds a higher value than our other ways of knowing, which have rigor and have sometimes relations to that science, but are not within that Western science paradigm. And archaeology has also historically excluded many voices, not just Indigenous ones, but many that don't fit the kind of heteronormative patriarchal system in which we live. And I'm very much inspired by what we can do differently. And I'm just going to really briefly put up 2 articles of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, because this to me lies partly at the core of what we're trying to do. And it really is about the rights of Indigenous peoples to our own cultural heritage. They're enshrined in Article 11, which talks about artifacts, historical sites, and in Article 12, which talks about our ceremonial objects and our ancestors. They say human remains, but for me, that's our ancestors. So these 2 articles ask us to rethink how archaeology has operated, because it has operated on the assumption that cultural heritage is everybody's right. It's not a specific inherent right to Indigenous peoples. And because of that, the systems that govern archaeology take it away from Indigenous people. So we cannot actually currently assert our rights to our own cultural heritage legally in Canada. So this is the challenge that we really face. And so what I really take then to archaeology is an approach that centers restorative justice. So what do I mean when I talk about restorative justice? Well, restorative justice seeks redress for historical and ongoing wrongs. This idea that we can use the tools of archaeology to reclaim, but also to tell the truth about the past that maybe is not always told, such as how many graves there might be of children around residential schools. We use techniques of archaeology, some of those very scientific techniques, to support community needs. And then often, frankly, to do really, really cool research too. Like the opportunities and the innovation when you work with communities is just mind-blowing. We focus on using archaeological knowledge for justice. So one of my other PhD students, Don Wombold, is doing work on Métis presence in Southern Alberta, which is going to have direct relations to contemporary rights. So it will help our communities to assert our rights to be in that place. We create space for different stories. Archaeologists tell stories. I don't care if they say they do science, they do, but they use science to tell a story. That's what we're doing. And so we're making space for different kinds of stories and being able to assert their validity, right? That they are real ways to know the past and they're valid ways to know the past. And really trying to undo those histories of harm and extraction, doing an archaeology that is restorative rather than that sense of removal. So how do we do that? There's a couple of examples that I'm just going to briefly run us through. I'm not going to belabor this too much because we're already running significantly more behind than we'd hoped, and we want some time for questions and for the really delicious food from an Indigenous chef that's waiting for us. So we've heard already about the AMITA project. The origin of the AMITA project for me was one trying to use archaeological information to assert our presence and our identity as a people, as a distinct people, and to move away from this idea of hybridity. And it's really also about reclaiming our stories and frankly, reclaiming my story. So this is my relatives. This is my great-great-grandpa, Alexis Supernant, and Marie-Flore Gaucher, my great-great-grandma. Alexis was born at Gruard near Slave Lake, and Marie was born at Lac Saint Anne, not too far from here. I didn't know them growing up because my father was taken from his community. And so I'm reclaiming their stories. They were alive in the time some of the sites that we're working on were lived in. This was their story, their lives. And the other piece that you see here, you can't read the document, you're not meant to, but it is the script record of my 3 times great-grandmother who was from the Papas Chase Cree. And the Papas Chase we were supposed to have a reserve here in Edmonton, and I'll talk about that more a little bit later on, but it was taken from us as well. And so I'm reclaiming my right to tell my family's stories, and I use archaeology to do it. So with the Métis project, one of the main things I wanted to push back against was this concept that what makes us Métis is being mixed blood. This is very pervasive even today, that anyone with an Indigenous ancestor is somehow Métis. That is not what that means. And, there is an origin to these mixed marriages between, European fur traders and Indigenous women, but the children of those unions married other children from similar unions. And if I can trace my genealogy back 5, 6 generations, and generation after generation, it's Métis folks marrying Métis folks, building that sense of community, we're distinct people and identity. But why is this such a pervasive idea of this mixedness? Well, I think it has a lot to do with how Western categories work. So it's this idea that you have, here's Indigenous and here's non-Indigenous, and you have to mix them together as there's somehow these 2 separate boxes. And we do this all the time. And I'm so inspired by Elder Ghostkeeper talking about how in Cree, there's so many verbs because the world becomes animate. And when you start speaking in English, the world becomes static. And it becomes static because we're trained to separate, to objectify, to categorize. And archaeology, let me tell you, does this all the time. We put things in boxes. This is a stone tool, and this is a bone, and this is, this material from this time period, and this is what that means. Everything is separated. Everything is taken apart, and it's put into museums. It's, the objects become the focus, and we lose so much when we focus on that categorization. So what do it mean then to do this from a more Indigenous perspective? Now, there are many Indigenous perspectives. Of course, there are many Indigenous peoples. But one thing that I've seen a lot of connection around is there are pieces that connect us. And I had a wonderful opportunity this week to sit with some beautiful colleagues from South Africa. And the resonance of our stories was so powerful. They're different, but they are also the same. Right? There's a lot of similarity in the ways in which we are in the world as Indigenous people. And so when we think about the connectedness, the things that are interwoven rather than the things that separate us, then we can center Indigenous ways of knowing and being, focusing on the connected, related, interwoven, embedded and lived experiences, that animation of life, that it's not about this object that I weigh and I measure and I take a photograph of and I write a little number on and put in a museum. It's not about that. It's about the story that that tells. It's about how that relates to all of those knowledge systems. So when I talk about engaging Indigenous knowledge or knowledges in archaeology, this is really what I mean. It's about how specific Indigenous knowledges, which are tied to place. And so when I work on Métis sites, I need to be attentive to Métis knowledges. But when I work on, say, a Cree site, I need to be attentive to Cree, right? So they're very embedded in the places, that we work closely with elders, with others who can share knowledge and language, determining the ceremonies that take place at the sites that we work. We always conduct ceremony when we're working on sites. Thinking about how knowledge has to be engaged all throughout research. So not just in the origin and not just in the practice, but how we care for the belongings of the ancestors. And how that Indigenous knowledge really challenges those Western frameworks and invites a much deeper and richer understanding of the past. So I do that with my nation. I do that with an understanding of this emergent nation, that did come out after contact, but we are a distinct people. We are a nation. We have a history. And that history, is tied to our assertion of our nationhood and who we are. And that happened in particular places at particular times, but we had many communities connected throughout the homeland, which is Western Canada, who had a sense of collective identity, right? And then we became a threat to Canada because we tried to assert our sovereignty, to say you have to have a nation-to-nation relationship with us because we are a new nation. And we resisted Canada's dominion. It wasn't rebellions. We didn't rebel. We resisted, right? We were trying to assert our sovereignty. And then it led to a huge amount of dispossession. Many families were broken apart after that resistance failed. And it just went underground for a while. We're coming back. So when I'm thinking about how I approach archaeological research on Métis places, I really am inspired by the sash, which I am wearing. And the sash is an important contemporary Métis symbol. It wasn't equally used in the past in all places in the homeland, but right now, in this moment, has a lot of resonance. And it would have been finger woven, so it would have been hand woven from a series of threads. So when I talk about weaving Métis kinscapes, which is my approach to Métis archaeology, I'm really talking not about weaving knowledges. I'm not talking about science and Indigenous knowledge. I'm talking about the parts of Métis ways of being and knowing that we can understand archaeologically. So, and that the threads in the sash only make sense when they're woven together. So I talk about Métis relations as the dominant color, the most important thing. And I don't just mean human to human relations. I mean relations to land, relations to plants and animals and spirit and the wind and the sun and the stars, the complex web of relations that we think of as kinscapes. So the idea of all those relations in place. Think about how we moved through these lands and how we moved through these different spaces and geographies, often over huge areas. But that doesn't mean we weren't from anywhere. We were from everywhere. Right? Just that movement doesn't discount our connection to place. And then the daily life. So Solen's work is really great about this and sort of that intimacies of daily life that we can see in archaeology, the little minutiae of how we lived. And then the economic practices that we had that fed us and clothed us and connected us together. But it is only in their weaving together that we can actually make sense, in my view, of a Métis history. So just as a little example of what I mean by the importance of relations here, I'm going to take us back to Chimney Coulee, which Solène mentioned, easiest ever archaeological site to find. There's a big giant sign, just points this way. Really interesting place because it had multiple occupations. So it had a pre-contact occupation and then 3 historic occupations. So from an archaeological perspective, you're like, ooh, 3 different types of material. Let's compare and try to figure things out. Really interesting that way. So we do historical research. We've done a lot of site mapping. I'm a total map nerd. You don't see it too much in this presentation, but maps are my jam. We did a bunch of remote sensing because one of the things that I've certainly learned from working with our communities is they don't want us to dig first. That's not the first instinct. Don't dig stuff up. But we can learn a lot without digging. We can map sites and we can understand things, and then we can be very specific about where and how and why we dig. And we work with the Métis community to identify the kinds of questions and things that they might want us to explore. And the food one has become really engaged with folks in Saskatchewan because they're interested in food sovereignty and reviving some of the Métis traditional food practices. So we're wanting to bring some of this knowledge that was taken from us back, and it's still in the land. So we do that by doing that remote sensing and mapping things out. I take all the tech, bring all the tech out to the field and all the batteries and all the computers, and then always have tech problems just like we saw tonight. It's inevitable. And then we're very specific about where we dig. And when we dig, we offer tobacco before we start, and we offer tobacco when we're done, because we are taking. And so there's that idea of connecting in and recognizing the gift that is being given to us from that taking of those belongings. And so we always recognize that through protocol. We also find beads, so many beads. If you're looking for beads at a Métis archaeological site, you will find them in the thousands. Unfortunately, most of the time in archaeology, we don't use fine enough screens to find beads. These are like, you know, the types of beads that are in my earrings, right? Tiny, tiny. So we have to use specific methods to make sure that we're finding those beads. But when we look for them, they are everywhere. Most of the time they're scattered kind of throughout the various parts of the site, but every once in a while, something really cool happens. So at the Chimney Coulee site, my graduate student, Eric Tebby, who's just finishing up his master's now, was excavating as part of his master's program, and he came across a beadwork pattern. This beadwork pattern was intact. So normally it's the single beads. This was a flower bud that was still in the same pattern that it would have been when it was discarded. And you can see similar motifs and patterns in Métis beading and embroidery from the same time. Of course, the first thing Eric does, I wasn't at the site at the time, he calls me. He's like, I found a thing. What do I do with the thing? So I'm like, I don't know. I called the museum. I was like, what do we do with the thing? Because I didn't want it to be disturbed. I wanted to be able to remove it without breaking it apart. And so they were good at helping us figure out how to do that. So we were able to take it out. And then we brought it back to the university, and I was doing some labby archaeology things with it to make sure that it would maintain that being intact. And it was in a lab across campus in the SAB building. And then I started dreaming about the beadwork. And then I started hearing the beadwork because it wasn't happy being in a sterile lab. And so I listened. And this really was a transformative moment for me, because it had me reflect on a concept that Solène had brought up already, that of Whakotewin. This idea that Whakotewin is about all of those relations, those interconnected relations that we have. And it made me realize that this is not an object that sat in a lab. This is my relation. And I mean that not in a metaphorical way. I mean it in a literal way. This is my relation, and I have responsibilities to care for this relation in ways that make sense to our community. So what happens when you have artifacts that are relations as opposed to objects, that are belongings of our ancestors, that are still connected into those systems? It means that we have a responsibility to make sure they remain connected in the present. And honestly, it means we don't want them to be institutionalized. And putting belongings in museums is institutionalizing them. So trying to explore different ways of caring for those belongings. And so when I have relatives come and visit me, human relatives come and visit me, they come and visit the beadwork. And then I visit with my relations. And as I was preparing for today's talk, I realized I needed to bring my relation with me. So it's here with me on stage, one of my relatives, helping me to do this work and helping to teach you about what might be possible. And it sits with medicines, so it's still in its box to make sure it's protected in that way, but it has tobacco and it has sage. And one of my Métis cousins brought some tea, because tea and tea practice is really important in our communities, and it's here. So it brings me to that question of care. So what does it mean to care for the belongings of the ancestors? And archaeological databases, where we put all these measurements and this data and this information we gather, are very Western. They're very categorized. They're very structured. And so I'm working with my community, with those who hold knowledge, those who are interested in this question of our material heritage and elders, to think about how would they want to care for this relative, but also to learn about it. What are the questions that they would ask, which is not what material type is it, or, which projectile point is it, Avonlea, or is it, that's not what they want to know. They want to know if it's from a place where their relatives were. They want to know what story it tells. They might want to know how it's made, right? Where it comes from. But ultimately, it's about story. It's about family. It's about place. It's about teachings. It's about language. What would we call this in Cree or in Michif? So this is very nascent, but I'm really fundamentally challenging the ways in which we categorize archaeological data to open up new possibilities. There's another part to restorative justice that I will briefly talk about today. And some of you may be familiar with the work I've been doing over the past few years to help find the unmarked graves of our relatives. I'm going to talk about that today. I am not going to talk about residential school sites because that is not a story that I can tell in this context. It's not research. That's a type of work that I do in service of communities. But the project I am going to tell you about uses very similar methods and approaches for a very similar purpose, but this is one that I have been given permission to share in a public way, and also specifically relates to me and my family. So we have been using remote sensing and geophysical techniques, basically ways of looking at and below the surface of the earth without digging, to try to detect places where our ancestors and relatives may be buried. Of course, this has become very important in the search for missing children around residential schools. But in 2019, I actually worked in Edmonton and in the southern part of Edmonton to try to locate a burial ground associated with the Papas Chase Cree, which again, I'm descended from them. I had the opportunity to work with Chief Bruno and the council to identify an area that was of concern and was potentially slated for development. They were very concerned that they were going to be, our relatives were going to get dug up. So I worked with the Archaeological Field School here at the University of Alberta to do an evaluation of an area in the southern part of Edmonton. For people who are in Edmonton, it's behind the Taylor College and Seminary on Black Mud Creek, just down south of 23rd Street near 119th Avenue, right kind of on the edge corner of where our reserve was supposed to be. We surveyed using ground penetrating radar to search below the surface. We used magnetic radiometry, both of which are methods to detect changes in either the magnetic field or the soil itself that can help us understand potential unmarked graves. And we brought out the field school students to participate in that. And actually one of the field school students from that year is working for us at IPIA, Madeline here. And it was very much community driven. We did ceremony with Elder Fernie Marty. And when we were doing ceremony, he was talking and he had a feeling, which I think we do. When I'm walking on places where I'm pretty sure that there's children buried, I feel it differently than where they're not likely to be buried. And he didn't feel much in the field behind the college, but he had pointed over to an area beside the kind of bush, and it's on City of Edmonton property actually. And turns out that was the one place that we found results. The area in the field behind the college was very clearly disturbed. It was almost too even. You wouldn't expect Earth to be that even. So something had happened there where they transformed the land. But in this little spot by the forest, right above the Black Mud Creek, and there's quite a steep drop to the creek, we found potentially 3 unmarked graves. And this was right in an area that some of the history had said it would be. And we were able to take both the magnetic data and the ground penetrating radar data to be able to line them up together and indicate that there were likely some relatively shallow graves in this area, which they would have been traditional Cree burials, which would have been shallower than a typical Christian burial. And what's been shared with me is that oftentimes Cree burials would be above water, so near a water source, but on a higher point. And that's exactly where we are here. So we don't know if we found the full extent of the ancestors. One of the challenges is that ground penetrating radar doesn't work well in the forest. We have to have the unit actually on the ground to send the electromagnetic signal down. So when you're looking at areas of bush, you can't really use it. But we want to protect the area. There's the face of the bank is eroding, and there's concern, of course, if we have graves, you could have bodies coming out of there. So we'll be keeping track of that. And there's many other places in Edmonton, of course, that have burials that we don't know. They're not marked, they're not recognized, they're not protected. And there's many places where our ancestors have already been dug up. And many times they ended up in museums and in universities. And a lot of them are returning home, but it's a long process. And of course, I can't not talk at least a little bit about this type of work to find the missing children. I mean, we know how many of our children, over 150,000 children being forced to attend what were called residential schools, but they were being institutionalized for the purposes of genocide. And this doesn't even account for all the Métis children who were taken, right? A lot of it's focused on First Nations, but there were lots of my relatives as well. Thousands of these never came home, and many of them died of a variety of diseases, neglect, violence, abuse. Many children were buried in community cemeteries, maybe with a little wooden cross, but with no ceremony. Their parents didn't even often know. They just found out when their children didn't get off the plane or the boat or come home. So the pain of this loss is so great. And when Tecumseh had announced that they had located potentially 215 unmarked graves, this had a huge outcry, as many of us, of course, know. And in this time, 8 days before the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, I think it's really important that we continue to keep this in our hearts and our minds, because we have barely begun this work, barely begun. And we've already found, a lot of potential unmarked graves, but we haven't even scratched the surface. So communities need our support, and a lot of my work has been to help advise communities on how to approach this. We have, of course, done some work on the ground. And now I'm also helping to shape the national approach to make sure that we're supporting communities in equitable ways, in ways that they need and that they tell us that they need. And I have an amazing team at the IPIA who's been helping me, and particularly my program coordinator, Talisha Chaput, who's also Métis and has been doing an amazing job helping. So coming back to the question of then archaeology and restorative justice, I like to say what we do at IPIA is doing archaeology that matters to people other than ourselves. To do archaeology that matters other than just the intellectual pursuit of understanding the past. But we're doing it for ways that address the wrongs that have been done to so many different peoples, that really put the core of what we do in terms of what the community wants and needs. And then we get to find the really cool ways to do it, bugs and, remote sensing and all kinds of cool things, but they're addressing what the community wants us to address. Working for that change in policy and practice, and I'm hoping to see more of that. And I'm increasingly convinced that what we need is a federal framework, because what happens in Canada is that archaeological resources are managed at the provincial and territorial level, and there's a lot of inconsistency, and change is a lot harder when you have to change 12 different acts rather than having one overarching one. And we'll see how that goes. Bringing that Indigenous knowledge and theory and practice into all of the work that we do upholding Indigenous rights to heritage and Indigenous heritage values. So not assuming that, the values that we're taught as sort of Western archaeologists are the ones that communities may have. So this idea of don't dig. Maybe we just don't dig very much, or we dig in very small kinds of ways, or looking at different kinds of spaces and places that communities want us to. But ultimately for me, I have a 7-year-old daughter, and she's growing up knowing she's Métis in a way that was stolen from me. So I think about the future, transforming the past for the future. We're taught to look 7 generations back and 7 generations forward. So everything that I do is not for me, it's for her. It's so she can live in a better world. She will know her stories. She will be proud of who she is. And that everyone in that generation will have a different sense of pride in what it means to be Métis, what it means to be Indigenous, and that we can see real transformation. So yes, it's a very, very long journey, and it's hard sometimes. The work of finding graves is heartbreaking. But what keeps me going is that hope for the future, that sense that we can build a better archaeology, we can support Indigenous rights, and ultimately we can build a better future for everyone in Canada and beyond. So hi, and thank you for listening.
Kisha, honey, thank you. Sincerely, I can't tell y'all enough how deeply difficult it is to intermix academic work with your identity. It's profound in a way you don't want it to be, but it has to be. So someone who's able to do it and make a difference deserves everything in the world. So thank you for sharing with us. I really appreciate it. So we're having all 3 of our scholars come up, have a seat, because we're going to do the Q&A. All right. So how's that going to work? All right. We're going to take questions from the audience. If y'all have a question, raise your hand. One of our lovely volunteers will get y'all a microphone. If you're online, hey, I'm glad y'all are still here. Type in a question. I'm sure there's like a form or something, and I get it on someone else's cell phone. Wait, is there another one? Oh yeah, no, people sent some in beforehand. Okay, so y'all ask a question. I'm gonna hand the microphone off to one of our lovely scholars, and you'll get your answer. Okay, so does anyone in the audience have anything? Come on up. And in the meantime, I'm going to ask, we're going to go straight for a hot take question, okay? Because things are too intense already for us to go to a softball, okay? So the word transforming is a bit scary. Are you suggesting that the past methods for engaging with nature will be transformed, which to me implies a radical change? The process might be more of an adaptive aid for the future because much has changed. We're rebuilding nature more than just facilitating it and creating responsible use. Who wants to take it? Here, I'm going to hand you the thing so you can see it. It's the bottom.
Yes, thank you. I feel like that's both a comment and a question. So I'm trying to get a sense of what this is trying to get at. And I think how I'll respond to this is, I think we're trained in a way that we think of only one knowledge system as what we call hegemonic. It's a fancy word to say it is the dominant one. And I think when we're talking about transformation, people feel like, well, not only will the knowledge system that we currently have not be the dominant one, but that'll be somehow subsumed under others. But that's really not what we're talking about here. And I come back again to the teachings of Elder Ghostkeeper. This is about equal space for knowledge systems. It's not that one is overlaying or disproving or validating or not validating the other. It's the recognition of the plurality of ways of knowing and being in the world. There's so many ways to be in the world. But what's happened is over the history of archaeology and the history of colonialism is that many of those others have been suppressed, have been diminished, have been called myth and story and not given validity. So we are asking for a radical change, but not an erasure of existing knowledge systems, but a shift in the way we understand the complexity and diversity of those knowledge systems and what they can really contribute, not only to our world of archaeology, but to so many challenges that the world faces today. Because frankly, what we're doing right now is not working. It's not working, right? There's so much that's happening in the world right now, it's not working. So why wouldn't we look to other ways of knowing and being and listen and not take them, but listen to those who know them to imagine different ways of being in the world. So yes, it can be uncomfortable at times and unsettling, but it's not about replacement. It's about that expansive sort of sharing and bringing together. Anyone else want?
So y'all knew you were going to get some of my hot takes asking me to be an MC. I'll say less diplomatically, no, y'all want Kisha to do this and not someone like me. Okay, that's all. Because yeah, it'll get transformed. Right. Okay. So new question. Okay. This is from the audience. Oh, all right, here we go. Sorry, the online audience. It's kind of a mouthful, this one. So we're just going to get the gist of it. Okay. And oh, there's also a short one that just popped up. We can get to that later. That's an easy question. Okay. So I'm a white man, pretty new to becoming an ally to Indigenous people. I'm hoping that online and this audience is full of people who that applies to. I am familiar with TV shows on European and African archaeology. Can you speak to how Indigenous-led archaeology can correct lies like terra nullius, right? So that was in italics earlier, Latin for ain't nobody here, and the empty landscapes, etc. So basically, how can you use archaeology and Indigenous-led archaeology specifically to correct real incorrect stuff?
Thank you for your question, and thank you for your journey of being an ally. It is a journey, and I encourage everyone to really explore what that means. So first of all, TV shows. Check out Wild Archaeology. Wild Archaeology is a show that is Indigenous produced, directed, and airs on APTN and features Indigenous archaeology from across mostly Canada, and there's a couple of ones in the United States as well. It has a couple of Indigenous hosts and an Indigenous colleague of ours, an archaeologist named Rudy Reimer, and we do all kinds of fun things. We were actually on the show at Chimney Coulee in the second season. So if you want an alternate way of actually looking at what's happening, check out Wild Archaeology. Good for all ages. But I think our Indigenous archaeology can really help to counter this idea of empty land. But I want to begin by saying Indigenous people don't need us to do that. They know that we were here and have been here since time immemorial. And I always want to be really careful that we're not using archaeology to validate that, but we're using it to provide evidence that sometimes non-Indigenous people better understand or are more equipped to listen to. So when we can show, actually, I'll maybe ask this, does anyone have any guesses, not those of you who might know, how many archaeological sites are in the province of Alberta? Anyone want to gander? Anyone? Okay, 1,000 I hear up there. 10,000 at the back. Over 40,000 and counting. We have a winner. Over 40,000 recognized archaeological sites in the province of Alberta. If that doesn't tell you that this was not an empty land, I don't know what will. So yes, there is power in the archaeology and power in Indigenous-led archaeology because we can really point that out and we can really say that's, you know, so much history there. And that's only the ones that we've only really been counting since the late 70s. So how many are gone, right? Probably at least that many. So I think it's just remembering that there is so much beneath our feet. There's a tendency to think about archaeology as elsewhere, right? You know, Egypt or Europe or whatever, it's right under our feet, right? Everywhere we go. So I think that really helps to counter that narrative. I don't know if Steph, did you want to add anything? You're making me answer all the questions.
And I'm going to give a little comment after every one of them. So it's not just under your feet. It's on the land everywhere around you. Okay. These are what we call anthropogenic landscapes, which means people are doing stuff to the land that we can track in where trees grow, where and why different animals even exist in different places. You know, you notice how there's pigeons in a city? That's the anthropogenic thing, right? So it's everywhere and under your feet. You're like a fish in water and you don't even know it. Okay. So does someone in the audience have a question?
Hi, thank you for sharing your perspective on how you feel about museums and those being institutionalized. I actually, in my experience, found them to be quite helpful to stumble upon something that I didn't know and then become curious and learn about it. I'm wondering what your thoughts and perspective are on increasing accessibility of Indigenous knowledge and culture for those who may not be actively pursuing it or seeking it. Thank you.
I think it's a you question too, but I wanted to stare at the grad students for a second first. Do y'all want to answer this one?
No, I thank you for that. And I think that a lot of people have had experiences of encountering Indigenous history in museums. And I think that I'm not fundamentally opposed to the idea of a museum, but I want them to be Indigenous led. I want them to be shaped in ways and narratives that we decide. And we can tell that and share that in the ways that make sense to us. Because we do have ways. And we do value the belongings, and there are ways to share that. But they should be owned and operated by Indigenous people. And collaboratively talking about, like, say if we have a place like Edmonton, which has always been a place of gathering. It's not like one nation, this is their territory forever. There's many nations who have connections. So let's bring those nations together to say, how do we narrate our history of this place and make sure we share it? Because we do want to share it. I don't want to keep it to us, but I don't want someone else to tell it on my behalf. I don't want someone to tell it for me. I want to be able to tell it myself, because there's a lot of power in that. And so I think we have a lot of possibilities. I mean, yes, there's the physical museum, but we have so many tools now. We have digital tools. You know, I think about the database I want to create. That would be a space where everyone could come and learn about Métis history through a database that's shaped by us. Or we could think about, you know, augmented reality or storytelling. Like, there's lots of ways to do it. But the fundamental question is about who's telling it and who's ultimately in charge of how it's being told. So that's really, I think, where I want to see a shift, is in where that right to make decisions sits about what we tell and to whom we tell. Because there's also sacred knowledge which should not be shared widely. You have to earn the right. You know, you have tobacco questions, which we were talking about earlier today, which require the offering of protocol to receive an answer. And those need to be respected as well. But if you don't know that those are sacred, then you might tell them, you might find them in an early ethnography that an anthropologist wrote, and not realize that that's sacred knowledge, that that's knowledge that has protocol. So those are all the things that I think about. It's not that I don't want to tell our stories, but I want us to tell them.
I mean, from my very limited knowledge of museum studies and related things, just Kisha, you said something about having the right to that knowledge. And I think that's a very crucial point, that maybe when museum initially started and were created, that's not a question that was asked. And I think museums overall would really benefit from having more Indigenous perspectives and Indigenous people involved in, you know, what objects are being acquired, how they're presented, how they're stored, et cetera, because so many of the objects that are currently in museums, in fact, did not necessarily arrive to these museums in a good way. We're not meant for museums. We're not meant to be displayed, like ancestors, for example, and special belongings that are meant for ceremonies. So I think, like Kisha, like, museums are not inherently bad. They're great places to learn about things that you don't know anything about, literally. But there needs to be a lot of change. Yeah.
I can on to that. When dealing something that brings to mind is when I'm dealing with pseudo-archaeologists, I often hear these comments that pseudo-archaeology is creating interest in archaeology. That like, you know, I need Giorgio Tsoukalos, host of Ancient Aliens, to tell people to be interested in archaeology. No, it doesn't create interest in archaeology, it creates interest in pseudo-archaeology. And the same idea, I think, can be applied in museums. When you think about when these belongings were put into these cases and who's actually writing the stories about these belongings, who's putting the information out there, who's choosing to display them in certain ways. Are you learning about the objects, or are you learning about the perspective of the person who put the objects in the case? That's something I think to think about. Because I agree totally. I love museums. I think museums are wonderful places, but they need a lot of work.
And that just brings one more quick thing to mind. And I know we're all probably getting tired and hungry and wanting to move on soon. We hear a lot of talk about collaboration, and I think that's wonderful and it's important. But the work that we do in IPIA is community driven, not necessarily collaborative, meaning that it's not about, oh, let's, find a research project that works for everyone. It's like, what do you need? How do we match it? And I think also collaboration doesn't take into account enough the idea of consent. Because one of the things that I don't see enough of, we talk about, well, we consulted with Indigenous communities before we built that pipeline. But if communities never had the right to say no, then it's not meaningful. And I feel the same way about belongings. If we don't have the right to say, no, that should not be on display, then it's not being done in a good way, even if you've talked with an Indigenous person who, it consulted about it. So I think fundamentally we need to have that conversation about consent, free, prior, and informed consent, and Indigenous, ownership and data sovereignty, right? So this idea that it ultimately is up to us to be able to say yes or no. And so, yeah, I just wanted to add that as well.
And my peanut gallery response is that, I think a lot of people think of this the wrong direction, right? So we saw this in the United States with the passage of our repatriation law, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, where this like primal fear gripped every museum in the country, okay? They're gonna empty the museums. We're not gonna be able to work. History is gonna be erased. In reality, following what Kisha was talking about earlier, about how much more we can learn and how broad the understandings are that we can get out of archaeological material when working with an Indigenous group. Putting the decision-making and the thinking in the hands of the people who descend from those who produce that material fundamentally just escalates how much we can learn. So it's not closing it off. We're opening up the museum, okay? And it's already happening, okay? This is happening. Y'all want to go see a museum like this? Go to the Burke in Seattle. It's the University of Washington's museum. They did a great job with that. Go to Flagstaff. Go to the Museum of Northern Arizona, okay? These are places that are already there. They're already thinking about whatever the next thing is. So I think it's not about closing it off, it's about opening it up. And if you go to the Burke, you'll see what I mean. You're like, what about these kayaks? This is crazy. Okay, sorry. Okay, do we want to do one more? We should wrap up. Yeah, it's late. Y'all, thank you so much for coming to this, even though it's run a little late. I'm trying to find my last sheet of paper, but I might not have it. There it is. Okay, so on behalf of the Institute for Prairie and Indigenous Archaeology, I want to extend a big thank you to our presenters, President Flanagan, Dean Wood, and all of y'all who took the time to care and come and learn something, learn about a little pseudo-archaeology, learn about some real archaeology. And yeah, I want y'all to have a good night. And the most important part, the Institute of Prairie and Indigenous Archaeology would love your support in a variety of ways. It's meaningful. Donating to the IPIA is what makes this happen. It's what makes this happen. It's what makes that happen. our students getting PhDs, working with communities, restoring justice. Donate, y'all. We have QR codes where you can donate. Y'all can buy swag at the bookstore. Do it. Thank y'all.
And just a big hand for our awesome MC, Maggie.